Hi, this is Lynn Mayo from RePicture. And today we're going to talk about land development, or also called site civil design careers. So we have with us Carlos Ostria. Now, Carlos is the Chief Executive Officer of AMT LLC, and we're quite excited to have him here today. So Carlos, could you start with just saying a little about AMT?
AMT is about a 525-person consulting engineering firm that has offices throughout the Mid-Atlantic. And we do things like transportation engineering, site civil, land development engineering, water resources, and environmental resources. And we also do a fair amount of construction management and inspection work. We're pretty diversified, and our client base goes from private clients to municipal to the federal government and anything in between.
That's great, great. So my first question is, can you explain what site design or land development engineering is?
Sure. Initially, when people think of that, they think of developers, but in essence, land development and site civil engineering covers anything that deals with a property and anything that deals with getting a property ready for construction. Whether it's vertical construction, buildings, there's a lot of stuff that happens at ground level, or whether it's a large military facility where you're putting in an airfield. All of those things require site civil and development of the property, land development in essence.
Okay, great. And I've heard the terms, especially when I was looking at job openings, some people call it land development, some people call it site design, and some people call it site civil. Is there a difference between those three terms?
Well, I think the difference in terms of what you actually do is very minimal. The difference in the terms deal probably more with the type of client that you're working with. Land development usually will refer to working for home builders or developers of properties where they're developing apartment complexes or whether they're developing single family um, properties or anything in between, but it's primarily relating to private sector type of work. Site design could be both, and it is both. And that could straddle more of the municipal side and the federal side and the state side. And site civil really applies to all of that because the elements that go into the design of a property are pretty much the same, regardless of whether you're in the public sector doing single family homes, a private sector doing single family homes, or the public sector where you're doing something for the federal government.
Okay, that's great. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about site civil or site design or land development. When I use those terms, it sounds like it's going to be interchangeable. So can you explain, well, what the actual site design engineers do?
Okay. Well, when I first came out of college, I never knew that I was going to embark in a career that spans over 30 years doing what I do, which is three things that you described. And in essence, a site civil engineer or a land development engineer will design do all of the design necessary for the preparation of the site for construction, which would include sediment erosion control design, would include any grading to get the property leveled or ready for whatever you're going to build on it, includes the design of all of the utilities that are going to serve the property or any utilities that you need to get relocated. I always equate it to anything from the surface below ground. And that involves also stormwater management to deal with all of the environmental regulations that are there. We work a lot with landscape architects. They're really a supplementary discipline to land development. So it's utilities, it's grading, it's stormwater management, it's water resources. Sometimes you have to do stream restoration, you have to do some sort of environmental design, and anything in between. And that's in essence what civil engineers that in this line of work would do. The nice thing about this profession is that you get to work with a lot of other disciplines. You get to work with architects when you're doing a building, architects, mechanical engineers, plumbing engineers, electrical engineers, structural engineers, geotechnical engineers required on every single project that we work on. That's a civil engineer, but it's primarily dealing with the geology of the site. Like I mentioned, we work with architects, landscape architects, environmental professionals when we're doing environmental restoration. We work with arborists. We work with a lot of different disciplines. So it really opens you up to, exposes you to the effort that goes from a lot of professionals to get a project built.
So that's interesting, between the person's doing a lot of different things in site design, but then also working with a lot of different professionals. So it's interesting. It's probably one of the few fields that all the things you learn in school is at civil engineer. It sounds like you use or you interact with people with that, which is really interesting, and not like a lot of other fields than civil engineering. That's great. Although there's so many different things you can do, is there kind of a typical, someone is just coming out of school or switching into site design? What's a typical workday like, for a more junior person just starting their career out?
Well, I started off by saying that we're a consulting engineering firm. So we're in the business of preparing documents and plans and design plans. We're a design firm. So we like to design things. And if we're doing transportation projects, we have engineers that design bridges, and that's what they do primarily. That they spend their time designing. So from a site civil standpoint, when we have an entry-level engineer, or whether we have somebody that's switching careers and coming into this field, obviously is learning the process of how a project starts from concepts all the way through how it gets closed out during construction, and and anything in between. So we try to expose our new engineers to the process, both in having some field work to understand how things really get done out on a site, to working on, and I forgot to mention earlier, surveys. Surveys a supplementary service to what we do, and so I usually put engineers with a survey crew for a couple of weeks, where they get to get exposure to both construction layout work and both to also design surveys. So it's really you get your boots on the ground, and it's not just sitting in your desk and punching keys and hoping that everything turns out at the end. But site civil and land development is very process driven. It's a highly regulated. Development of real estate is highly regulated, whether that's federal real estate or private real estate. And usually you're involved with a lot of local ordinances and all the way to federal regulations that govern how you're going to build things and what you're going to design to.
So how much, it sounds like you talked about, there's both office work and field work. For an entry-level engineer, like how much time would they spend in the field versus in the office versus meeting with clients?
Well, usually in the entry-level side, what we try, obviously, most universities do not prepare engineers to actually start designing things. Professor one time told me that when kids come to school and learn how to be an engineer, they're learning all of the theory, all the calculus, all the classes that you took, and you wonder how in the heck you're going to apply that to the real world. Well, when you get to the real world, you kind of put those textbooks aside, and now you've been taught critical thinking. You've been taught to be very pragmatic in problem solving and all that, and that is fantastic. So now we got to teach you how to do things, quote unquote, in the real world. So one of the first things that we do is get you really immersed in our computer software that we use, whether that's design software or computer aided design like AutoCAD or MicroStation, those type of things. So you'll spend a lot of time learning that, because that's usually the tool through which we design and produce plans, etc. So you spend a fair amount of time on that, some time out in the field, to get an idea of what you're doing. And then, as you progress, you get more client interaction, you get more, I mentioned agency interaction, where you're dealing with different agencies that regulate what you're designing. And then progressively, as you, as you go through your career, you start managing projects and all those type of things.
Okay, great. So it sounds like there is some field work, especially after you learn kind of the basics as far as the softwares and tools and things like that. When you're doing work in the field, what type of work would a site design engineer typically do when they do go out in the field?
Usually it's construction observation, or it's usually on the pre-design side, is to go out and take a look at the property, or to take a look at at the project site, whether it's on a federal facility, and if they want to put a building in an existing parking lot, you try to get an idea of what's around you and what sort of things you got to deal with. So a lot of it is on the front end, which is, observation and trying to document the existing conditions of a particular project. And then throughout the construction, usually when it goes into construction, then there's certain milestones where we want to be out there to take a look at the progress of the property, and then sometimes at the very end to try to close out a project. So it's primarily construction observation. We're not the type of, site civil doesn't really involve construction inspection type work where you're out there all the time.
Okay, great. So what's been your favorite project?
My favorite project was probably the U.S. Coast Guard headquarters at St. Elizabeth's campus here in Washington, D.C. It was a very complex project. It happened right during the middle of the recession of 2008, and it was a fast-track project, and the government was investing some money to keep things going. So the Coast Guard relocated their headquarters into this particular property, and it had a lot of challenges. The site was in existence probably from the mid 1800s. And, so there was a lot of contaminated soils. There was a lot of unsuitable soils. There was a lot of challenges on the stormwater side. We designed probably, if not at the time, the biggest green roof for the project, both in a parking lot and on the existing building. I would encourage anybody that listens to this to go into into St. Elizabeth's site and look at the U.S. Coast Guard headquarters. It's a pretty neat project. Now, I've had many that I've loved over the years, but that's the one that this is recent. Not that recent, but recent enough for me.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you hit on something. I'm not sure I've talked to you about this, but I actually started my career in site design for the first several years. And one thing I love about it is you can actually go back and visit things and see the things that you did. So I love that idea. You can go visit that green roof and say, you know all the history of how that green roof, became.
It is, and this office is, our headquarters is in Rockville, this office here in DC. You get to see a lot of the different things that we work on. And you're right, you're correct. And that's, you drive by and you say, hey, I worked on that particular project, or I worked on that particular, not necessarily the building, but you did all of the stuff that supports that building. That's, when somebody flushes the toilet, that it's going into a sanitary system that you design. And when somebody opens up a spigot, the water comes up because you fed the building. So, it is a source of pride when you're driving around different areas and you see projects that you've actually worked on.
That's great. So if someone did want to get into site design, we're talking about the civil engineer and the engineering aspect. It sounds like a lot of different people involved, but the civil engineering aspect, what concentration? Because as you know, like in school, you can often, concentrate in geotech, structures, water, etc. What concentration would you suggest if people wanted to get into site design engineering?
Usually the concentration, because there's very few schools that have that element of site design in their curriculum. I think Virginia Tech touches a little bit on it. George Mason here locally also touch on it. I don't know about other areas in the country, but primarily most people have an interest in water resources because from a site civil design, every property that we touch, and again, whether it's public or private, requires stormwater management, the control of runoff, and the dealing with the quality, water quality. Because anytime you go in and take a part of a forest out and you put a parking lot, it's not going to be the same. So the requirements, dictate that you treat that water that's coming off. So it's that's probably the most math heavy thing that we get involved in. If you're working on subdivisions where you're working for a home builder that's going to design or construct 1,000 single family homes, there's a lot of transportation work involved in it. A lot of road design. Although there's streets, there's a lot of road design profiles, sections. A lot of drainage. So it's that type of discipline. A geotech wouldn't necessarily be a good fit on the site civil because although we work with a lot of geotechnical engineers, we don't necessarily deal with that aspect of it. We work with a lot of structural engineers, but we really don't deal with structural design, sometimes incidental structures. Transportation would be, something that we deal with also. So.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
So are there any software programs that site civil engineers use a lot?
AutoCAD and Civil 3D. Those are kind of the industry standard. And, if you're doing a lot of transportation work that as a firm, like I said, we're fairly diversified, it would be MicroStation and Inroads. Those are the two different packages. But from a design standpoint, if a college graduate comes out with, a fairly basic knowledge of AutoCAD, we're very happy, because we're not starting from zero. And it's funny, a lot of universities don't even, deal with that because it's a practical application of knowledge. They're just teaching you the knowledge, but not necessarily how to apply it.
Okay, great. And I know some universities, there might be like a different CAD, computer aided design software they use. Someone didn't necessarily learn AutoCAD or MicroStation, but learn, some other maybe generic, CAD software. How easy is it to kind of translate what you learn with the generic CAD into one of those two softwares?
We always assume that, we want to teach them the right way to do things. So, most students that graduate these days that come as entry-level engineers to our firm have a pretty good basic understanding of software, and the new generation can learn new programs fairly quickly. And we have both web-based training modules that we use, as well as hands-on, and we do a lot of training for staff at all sorts of different levels. So, but I would encourage all students that are looking to get into civil engineering, site civil, to try to learn AutoCAD or that particular software. I would imagine most colleges would have those, maybe an open license or something like that.
Okay, great. How about technical writing? Is technical writing important for site civil careers?
Technical writing is always important, from the beginning all the way to the end, whether you're writing proposals later on in your career, whether you're writing specific task orders that deal with contractual matters, or whether you're preparing a report that goes along with your stormwater management plan, explaining, how you're meeting all the regulations and what sort of design you've done to accommodate, regulations and accommodate site constraints, etc. So there is report writing. It's not a heavy report writing career, but there is plenty of report writing involved. So technical writing is pretty important.
Okay. How about public speaking or giving presentations? Is that something that people would do?
Public speaking and giving presentations comes a little later in their career, but it is something that they would do. Being a firm that has both private and public sector work, we do a lot of public sector work, which means a lot of times we're doing a presentation trying to win a project. So we have to do a presentation in conjunction with being part of an architectural team or being the prime entity that's pursuing that project. And so, yeah, public speaking is part, but usually comes down a little later in your career.
Okay, great. Are there other skills that are important if someone wants to get into site civil?
Um, organizational skills. And usually most engineers are pretty organized because that's kind of how their brains get trained. But it's being able to organize your thoughts and organize your project and organize, how it's going to flow is pretty important. We don't live in a linear world. So it's not, sometimes you're working on several projects at a time and trying to keep all of those organized and moving along is an important skill. And also communications, being able to communicate, um, like I said, on the report writing your design intent, all the way through to dealing with other engineers or dealing with the outside world, being able to communicate in an efficient manner is important.
Yeah, and I love that concept of multitasking and really being well organized. I think is great. Great idea that maybe I didn't realize when I was in college how important that is. So
No,
say I was a younger engineer and I actually started my career in a different field, but was looking into maybe going into site design. How easy is it for someone that maybe's worked, a couple of years in some other field to actually switch into site design?
I always think that the longer the time passes, the harder it is to switch. Because if you start off your career, let's say as a structural engineer, and 2, 3, 4 years later, you decide that that's not what you want to do because for whatever reason, um, and you want to switch to something different, and let's say that's site civil, you're almost starting at scratch with us because, it's really two different disciplines, even though they're civil engineering, they're really two different disciplines. Structural is very calculation heavy and very analytical and a lot of design and everybody has to pay attention to what they're doing because you could kill people, so we'd have to retool you. I'm not saying you would start from scratch, but we have to kind of remold you. So if you're thinking of switching, I always encourage people to do it sooner rather than later.
Okay, that's great. And if you are thinking of switching, is there anything that they can do to get ready? I mean, it sounds like maybe take some AutoCAD classes if they're not knowledgeable about that. Or but there are other things if someone wanted to switch into land development, is there other things that they can do to maybe make themselves more attractive to those types of companies?
Well, I think obviously if you want to switch from a different career into this, having a good resume that kind of tells your story, that talks about the different skills that we've talked about, your reasoning skills, your communication skills, your multitasking is important. Obviously, the software. If you're a structural engineer, you're probably familiar with AutoCAD. Okay. You may not be familiar with Civil 3D, but at least you're familiar with AutoCAD. So highlighting those type of things are important. And always take a look at one of your projects and look at it from a different view, even though you did the structural design on a particular, and I'm picking on structural design, but you did the structural design on a particular project. If you look at it from a different viewpoint, uh, you can highlight other things that maybe you coordinated with a civil engineer on a lot of different projects and things like that. So taking a look at something from a with a different eye, sometimes you'll get a different spin on it.
It's great. So we've already touched a little on this, but what do you think is the best part of working in site design or site civil?
I think the best part is that you're not necessarily tied to a computer all day long, number one. And number two, you're dealing with a lot of different types of projects because every project is different. Some are longer duration, some are shorter duration. If you're working in an urban environment, a quarter inch matters. If you're working in a suburban environment, maybe half an inch is okay. But you work with a lot of other disciplines, and the projects are very varied. They're all different. It's not just one typical thing. So
That's great. Now, this may be a little hard to answer, but you know, when you're coming out of school, there are a lot of choices you have. What type of person do you think is best for pursuing a site civil career, versus maybe one of the other disciplines that they could go to? Is there any type of person you think that really is going to thrive or do better in this site civil career?
it's a tough question because I have run into people that are very, very analytical and very math oriented, because our careers in school deal with a lot of analysis, problem solving. I remember when I took my physics class, I had like 500 problems to do in a week or something like that. So it's your mind gets set that way. So when you come into quote unquote the real world doesn't necessarily operate that way. So if you really are heavy into that type of, doing calculations and doing a lot of math, is probably not the field for you. It's more applied engineering is what we do. I always tell young people, look, you're not going to create a new equation on how water flows. It was created a few hundred years ago, and it hasn't really changed since then. So now you take that equation and you apply it, and you use it. And, in the old days, you used to do all your calculations by hand. Now it's all computerized, and it's all spreadsheets, and it's all programs that we purchase. So if you're looking for a lot of that, and it's always a hard transition when you're in school trying to figure out, well, how am I going to apply? Why do I need to take differential equations? Why do I need to take water resources and figure out, what the pressure on a wine bottle is when it's got a cork in it? How does that apply to the real world? Well, being on the site civil side, it's basically the applications are there. We're not there to discover new ways to do things. Well, maybe discover ways to design something different. But so if you're looking for more of the heavy stuff, it's probably not a field for you. It's applied engineering.
That's great. So it goes back to real world things. You can actually see the results of what you've done. Versus if you want to stay in the lab, it's probably not your area. It's more if you want to see what you're done. That's great. Is there anything else that's been really helpful? I've actually learned some things. Are there any other things that you think would be important for either civil engineering student or maybe a civil engineer who's early in their career, that's maybe considering if site design is right for them? Any other things you think?
I think the value of internships is great because try to get internships with firms, and whether it's a large firm or a smaller firm like us, a 500 person firm is considered a small firm, not real small, but it's just on the smaller side. Or whether it's an AECOM that has 100,000 people, a lot of firms have internships, whether they're paid or unpaid. Most firms pay their interns. And it gives you and work hard in trying to get an internship, because it's not going to people are not going to come knocking at your door. You're going to kind of have to work hard. And that's where Reimagine Engineering comes in. They're a great organization that sometimes can open up doors with firms for internships. And if you go in for a summer and you spend a couple of months in a site civil design firm, or a site civil department or transportation department, you'll kind of learn, what they do and whether it's something that you want to do. I kind of just happened to get into the field because it was my first job. And I never knew that coming out of school that's what I was going to do. So, don't do what I did, although I ended up loving it and had some success in it. There's the internships afford you an opportunity to kind of understand when you graduate what you may be doing.
Yeah, I think that's great, fantastic advice. And I want to thank you as far as, as you know, we kind of shared some interns. The 2 interns we had at AMT Engineering loved it. They only said great things about the people and the work. So definitely appreciate your help with that. And I definitely agree as far as just, many of us, start our career just because we happen to get the first job versus really thinking about it. So it's fantastic. I really appreciate, Carlos, your time today. Very helpful, and thank you. And for the audience, If there are other areas that you'd like to hear about, please email us at info@repictureengineering.com. And again, appreciate your time, Carlos.
No
Take care.
problem. Not to do it. Take care. Bye-bye.